All right. Thank you all for your patience. So we're gonna continue on today with the 19th flash, the third consequence, and Hamim will post up the link and share the screen. So inshallah, Hatice Beyza will moderate the discussion. So also billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين. Hatice Beyza, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Assalamu alaikum. Hope everyone is doing well. Inshallah, Farah had wanted to volunteer and she's available to moderate today. So I hope that's okay if she moderates right now. She has agreed to it.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. So inshallah we'll be starting today with reading the third consequence. Before I start, I'll briefly just mention one of the points that was discussed. It was an important point I felt that was discussed towards the end of the discussion last week. And it was a point that basically, in a way, revised a criteria that we were using to measure, if you will, what greed is, or how to know what greed was. And I know there was a brief discussion, or there was a discussion early on about this concept of like greed somehow being measured by a focus on, or an intention, or you could say like a motivation that was premised on somehow pursuing purely the quantitative side of something, as opposed to attaching to the meaning of it. And it was proposed towards the end of the discussion, a different type of criteria, instead of just thinking purely in terms of quantitative pursuit of something as marking greed, but rather as something that wasn't addressing one's need. And I also thought about this, and I actually I agree with this sort of revision, that greed is not marked by whether or not I, let's say, consume something in consume something by measuring its quantity, or thinking about it in terms of quantity. Like, for example, let's say there's an individual who is eats, let's say, a certain amount of food. It would only be characterized as greed if it is more than what he needs in that particular moment or situation, rather than whether quantitatively it was a large amount or not. Similarly, when we were talking about knowledge, it would not be characterized as greed if someone is, let's say, accumulating lots of knowledge, if in fact he needs that for according to how much he determines it to be. And it is certainly not greed, or doesn't count as greed, if someone actually is consuming something that is reasonably satisfying his need at that time. So keeping in this sort of criteria, or a new definition or revised definition of what constitutes as greed, we'll inshallah start reading the third consequence, because I think it will be helpful keeping this in mind. So if there are no questions at this time or comments, then inshallah I will begin. The third consequence. Greed destroys sincerity and damages actions in regard to the hereafter. For if a God-fearing person suffers from greed, he will desire the regard of others, and someone who considers the attention of others cannot have complete sincerity. This consequence is extremely important and worth noticing. In short, excess and wastefulness lead to lack of contentment, and lack of contentment destroys enthusiasm for work. It causes laziness, opens the door to complaining about life, and makes the dissatisfied person grumble continuously. And so this note says, if we can get a full view of it. Okay, thank you. Whenever you meet a wasteful, immoderate person, you hear complaints. No matter how rich he is, his tongue still complains. But when you meet even the poorest but contented person, you hear only thanks. So this was the note at the end of the sentence. Also, it destroys sincerity and opens the door to hypocrisy. And it destroys self-respect and points the way to begging. As for frugality and economy, these result in contentment. According to the Hadith, the contented person is respected and the greedy person despised. Contentment gives rise to self-esteem. It encourages effort and work. It increases enthusiasm and induces striving. For example, a person worked for one day. Because he was content with the petty wage he received in the evening, he worked again the second day. But because the wasteful and immoderate person was not content, he did not work the following day, or if he did so without enthusiasm. Also, the contentment arising from frugality opens the door of thanks and closes the door of complaint. Throughout his life, the contented person is thankful, and insofar as he is independent of others, due to his contentment, he does not seek their regard. The door of sincerity is opened and the door of hypocrisy closed. Shall we stop here and discuss this before moving? Or I'm happy to read the whole thing. I know there's some on the next page also, and then discuss it in one go. Let's see. Okay, I think I'll just stop here, discuss the points mentioned thus far. And then I know there's not too much left after, and inshallah complete it after we discuss this part. So in the third consequence, the author introduces a connection, an important connection to a new aspect that is influenced or connected, or definitely much influenced by greed. And that is the concept of sincerity. So greed is something that, as mentioned in this section, starts to influence one's sincerity, which requires a definition from us. But we understand that there's a indication given to how to understand sincerity, and that's something that is something that makes someone, or make someone regard the desire of others, and it somehow again leads to a lack of contentment. This insincerity leads to a lack of contentment, and something that influences someone's attitude towards their life, causing them to lack enthusiasm, become lazy, opening the door to complaining, and again something that leads to a lack of self-esteem, or the regards one has for themselves and the regard others have for them. So if we try to expound on this concept of, how is greed related to insincerity, or to sincerity, we described greed. Let's say, okay, if I take this criteria that we talked, or sort of started with, about the idea that one consumes or sort of seeks something more than what they desire, and hence sparking this feeling or attitude of greediness. So when greed destroys sincerity, I understand that sincerity in this context is something that perhaps is a feeling that of uniformity, of justice within ourselves, in the fact that a sincere attitude is one that is grounded in our reality of what we require, what we need, and sincerity seeks to exactly satisfy just, the exact sentiment or amount that we require in that case. And greed, a feeling that makes one, makes somebody feel and be under the illusion that they require more than what they need, would be something that seeks things that are extraneous to that need. And in this case, it would be somebody's desire to regard the attention of others. And desiring the attention of others has nothing to do with our reality to satisfy our human need for meaning, and for eternal meaning and satisfying it. We understand that seeking the contentment, or seeking the praise, or any sort of regard from other beings does not in effect satisfy our need for eternal satisfaction. So that's one way of understanding, I think that's one way of understanding something that seems to impurify our understanding of our needs, and instead seeking out something that doesn't satisfy us, our need. And this insincerity, or the consequence of this insincerity, is something that further leads to a lack of contentment. And the author describes that this lack of contentment is marked by a lack of enthusiasm for work. It causes laziness and opens the door to complaining about life. So as I was thinking about this concept of like, okay, the symptom of lack of enthusiasm, well, I can understand this as if I somehow lack a sense of meaning, or like, there's not a specific meaning behind my action, then that would be marked by a lack of enthusiasm. And this is something very naturally that we observe. For example, if there's a particular task that we don't really want to do, or don't have a particular reason for doing it, we also don't feel excited to accomplish it, and find all sorts of ways to delay it, or find excuses not to go ahead with it. So somehow in this position of excess and wastefulness, in this position of either not underestimating, but like perhaps having a false sense of assessment of our need, we will I would understand that having a false sense of our reality, we will probably indulge in things not knowing why we're indulging in them. If something is not satisfying any particular need, then it is perhaps lacks an aim or a direction. And when it lacks a direction, there's nothing that sort of organizes or motivates that, causing your attention to be sort of split and not be something not sort of following any particular direction, sort of seems to go in all sorts of different directions, and lacks a momentum in that case. And it says that it destroys sincerity and opens the door to hypocrisy. Again, like, a lot of concepts are being added to it, I feel, requiring sort of like a method or our criteria to sort of stay consistent in how greed leads to insincerity, to a lack of enthusiasm, laziness and hypocrisy, and our sense of worth, or self-worth, which is self-esteem. Obviously, at any time, feel free to add in your comments, anything that helps structure this thought process on how we connect a sort of, a misevaluation of our need, leading us to sort of just acquire things for the sake of acquiring things because I'm trying to understand or like take this concept of like, okay, I understand, even though I realize that I don't need something, I keep on indulging myself in doing that. That is inevitably leading one to sort of like meaninglessness or aimlessness. And when you are sort of just using up all your energy in something that has no direction, you're bound to lack or decline in energy and enthusiasm while going forward. Sorry, I didn't see your hands, but going in alphabetical order, I'll take Adam's sort of turn first. So go ahead, please.
Thank you. Got that name with the A. I think, first of all, thank you for laying things out. I think I'm curious as to what you and others think about this issue of greed relating to attention of others. I don't think that was clear in my understanding from the text, nor I don't think that's been really kind of mapped out for me. So, how does one who has this issue of greed, how does that, for some reason or somehow, jump to the issue of wanting to be regarded by others? That's one question. I think the other question I have, and we can start one by one, but then there's still more, I think, that needs to be discussed on other areas. So I'll stop there for now, and I see some other names are up. My hands are up.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question about how does greed lead to demanding or sort of desiring the attention of others? And we'll keep that question on the table while we take other comments. So Mustafa, please go ahead.
Actually, it's very similar to Adam's point. I don't really have a good definition of greed right now as it pertains to this consequence, because to me, greed has many different aspects and manifestations in us. Like, how are we greedy in this scenario? What kind of greed is it? Is it talking about lack of contentment as the definition of greed? And is that what is causing all these consequences? Or is it more than lack of contentment? I think, yeah, as Farah put it, like, what's the definition of greed here? And I think we need a clear understanding of it before I understand how it leads to these consequences.
Yep, thank you. I think that might be one of the first questions we tackled. But Hatija Beza, you've also got your hand up, so please share your thought.
Thank you for laying out everything for us in a very coherent way, Farah. I'm very excited for this. So I think what sparked something as I was listening to you, and in particular Brother Adam's question, was this relationship, also not to dismiss the question on the definition of greed, but this relationship between greed destroying sincerity, and that having to, or relating to desiring the attention of others. So the last paragraph that you read, it says, and insofar as he is independent of others due to his contentment, he does not seek their regard. The door of sincerity is opened and the door of hypocrisy is closed. So what I kind of took away from this was where he says he's independent of others due to his contentment is not a sort of independence as far as saying that he is independent in his existence, but independent of others, because one in that state of being realizes or recognizes that they are a recipient, or one is a recipient at all times, and everything is being given to them. So when it says he does not seek their regard, connecting this to considering the attention of others. What I understand is it's such a state of contentment in that one recognizes that everything is given to one. And I think, you know, this connecting to also what does contentment mean. Just one like rough overview was we had also defined greed as the way in which I see, or I get, I mean, essentially it goes down to worldview, but the way in which I see things, the being a consequence of the way I look at things in the world. So when it says the door of sincerity is open and the door of hypocrisy is closed for one who is not greedy, in other words, for one who is content, what I understand is that since one who is content realizes that what they are given is given indeed, it doesn't put them in a position where they have to feel like they have to you know, beg others on a horizontal relationship or human to human relationship, like begging others to get whatever it is that they want. And I think the main, you know, what one essentially needs, as Farah emphasized multiple times, is this need for meaning and internal security. I'm sorry for jumping around a little bit, but I hope that was clear.
No, thank you. I think you raised a point that we had also sort of been discussing for the past few discussions about how one defines themselves is how one views the world. And the definition of greed sort of being also drawn from one's sort of understanding of their own existence. I see, Mustafa, maybe you have your hand raised, maybe it's from before. Okay, great. Okay, so now we have a few questions. And we also have a comment from Adam. It says, is it fair to say greed inevitably puts one into serving and being influenced by others' interests, thereby obscuring his hereafter? Is it fair to say greed inevitably puts one into serving and being influenced by others? Right. So there is some consequence of, right. So there's some obscuring or negating one's hereafter is the addition to the comment. So my suggestion is that taking Mustafa's pretty fundamental sort of concern and question about what is the definition of greed, I will sort of request from everyone in the group to perhaps give their brief or long definition of greed, just so that we have one agreed upon definition, and I can start by doing so. And Fariha, I see your hand that went up, and inshallah I'll call on you. So as I understand, I'll give my definition, and knowing that this one is going to be under sort of, it will evolve and improve, and this is just like a sort of rough draft, if you will. I understand greed, as I mentioned, as a sort of assessment of one's reality and an assessment of oneself. And as pointed by Hatija, one's assessment of oneself is how one also sort of views the world. So my greed is an assessment of one's reality that is not in conjunction and in line with one's needs. And perhaps, if I think very preliminarily, greed is something like an overestimation of one's needs. So, for example, I'll give a simple example and then I'll try and sort of relate it to how we understand ourselves. So, for example, if let's say, okay, so for a particular week, I require a certain number of, let's say, liters of milk for my household. Accumulating more than that, than what I require, constitutes as greed, very simply put. In the existential sense, my requirement or my understanding of myself as a human being is the need for a meaningful connection or a meaningful understanding of my reality, a meaningful understanding being one that connects me with my desire for an eternal, for eternity, my desire for a meaning that sort of does not, is not bound by time or space. And therefore, assuming that my desires, my human desires, will be satisfied by something that does not, that is not sort of connected with an eternal dimension, would constitute as greed for me, where what I do not satisfy what I need, one, or I continue to satisfy or view my need in more than what it actually is. So I'll just leave it as that, and then inshallah we'll sort of try and evolve this definition and add and subtract. And Faria, if you wanted to go ahead, please, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Farah, and everyone else who put in their inputs. You know, just this text in itself is it's very dense, and it's also, at least for me, I've been having a hard time wrap my head around also, like in different places, what is the author possibly, what can he mean by greed, like putting greed up here. And based on our previous discussions, I agree in terms of what people shared about their comments, and at the same time, you know, like greed, we just call something greed, but to me it seems like an attitude that lacks awareness about the purpose of my existence. Because if we read into these texts, he's mentioning greed, wastefulness, excess, he's mentioning contentment, and I think some other quality. And if I recall last time, you sort of mentioned about the relationship between greed and contentment. So greed, we said, contradicts contentment. And greed can also be linked to, you know, being unsatisfied or unthankful, or sort of like an ingratitude type of attitude. And just like, you know, like you also shared in terms of, you know, like the typical definition of greed that, you know, we're all aware of is like, oh, wanting more and more and more. But then also I was checking in Brother Adam's latest comment. It's also about anything that we do here, we have to know or even be aware of, well, what is it that I'm doing? Why am I doing that which I'm doing? It's very interesting, the comment from Brother Adam and Hatija Beza, like I never thought of greed in this way, like you're serving others, and like that's very new to me. So I'm like trying to like really wrap my head around it, like what does it mean? So like if I'm in like the service of others, then I can be greedy in terms of just like maybe helping others, or, you know, or anything. Maybe if I'm just working, I can be just greedy for anything. You know, so it's really like an attitude or a quality that is unhealthy to my well-being as a human being. it's a quality that will impede my connection with the source of my existence. It will be a hindrance for me to recognize or acknowledge the true bestower of bounties, or really anything that revolves around helping me answer what is the purpose for my existence. Why do I do what I do here? And so bottom line, if we are to tailor question number 2 that Mustafa asked earlier, what is the definition of greed? Then I would say greed is a lack of awareness about the purpose of my existence. Thank you.
Thank you. And for clearly spelling out your definition succinctly, that greed is a lack of awareness of my situation. It's also seems to be a quality or concept that seems to be a hindrance and a distraction in my connection with my reality. Adit, your hand is up and you can go ahead.
Thank you. Sometimes I wonder who the text is speaking to, because if it's speaking to somebody who has no notion of belief and trying to undermine or trying to really like upheaval, right, or cause a huge shift in this person's thinking, maybe that's one potential mindset that he's speaking to. Or maybe, but also I think sometimes though he's speaking to somebody who has some idea of belief, okay, but may not see these connections clearly. And because of that, then he's trying to really make a good explanation and elucidation of what's happening. So I happen to think, maybe here I could be wrong, but I happen to think it's the second. Because I don't think, if you read this, for example, yes, it does talk about having a purpose for existence. Of course, that is always an underlying, theme and notion that's being discussed. But at the same time, I think is also trying to say, look, even if you have this notion, still you have to be very careful, because there's more to be told about how to live life and how to understand what's going on. So a person may claim to be believing, for example, a person may claim to be a believing person and be very conscious of the hereafter and things like that, but still have issues of greed. I know that's different than saying he's conscious about his purpose of existence, but I'm just saying that I think the author is still trying to go further in explaining an issue. So when he explains here, it sounds as though he's trying to really teach a person how to look at this matter more seriously and be more careful about it, because the two may coexist. You could still be, in a way, like I said, claiming, not just claiming, you may even have some consciousness about the hereafter, but you may have serious problems in your journey in life or whatever, because you have these underlying misconceptions about life. So anyway, I'm just saying that that's how I kind of see this particular part of the text going into clarification about this, and it's really interesting. I didn't think about these connections before. So anyway, that was just my comment.
Yeah, thank you. That's true. I mean, it's if we really do consider, okay, who's this speaking to? I mean, I do read these thinking, obviously, as you were mentioning, that someone could have a theoretical understanding of, let's say, a creator and a hereafter, but may fall on a spectrum, let's say, of having a sense of what is described as greed or insincerity, or seeking something that may not be directly related to his journey or connection with the source of existence. The other way I also think about it is like, you know, I think we also probably go through periods where we perhaps, let's say, quote unquote, are more greedy in some weeks than we are in others. And so I find it, yes, a helpful lesson, since it has to do with sincerity, which, as far as we, even if we take a very simple understanding of, you know, belief, it seems to be a very core quality to one's belief, which is sincerity. So if there is something such as greed influencing this attribute, then it is a subtle yet important lesson being taught here. So far we have a definition of greed, a convincing one that says, you know, it is a lack of awareness of my reality, and it has to there's a seemingly, in addition to that definition, saying sincerity is the main ingredient in all endeavors. Right. Good, fair point. Mustafa, your hand's up and you can go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for contributing and adding, I think, to the conversation. I think it clarifies it for me. I think, I don't know who said it first, but the best definition that, you know, makes the most sense and resonates with me is the idea that it's not just a lack of awareness, it's specific to me. It's a specific lack of awareness of your needs. I think that was mentioned early on. It says it's an overestimation of what you actually need in order to sustain, to be sustained, right? Everyone wants more. It's a natural human need to want the infinite, to want to live forever, to be, you know, sustained forever, to have everything. There is nothing wrong with wanting the entire universe and everything in it. I think that's, to me, innately human. But greed is like you guys put it, a lack of awareness of what you need. What makes you content is what fulfills your needs. And if there is a mistake in perception of thinking, you know, I need a house that's built to house 50 people because I have all these things and I need all of them. But the reality is maybe that I only need a house for 2 people, and that's perfect, and it is more appropriate to my needs. And I think that is much clearer and a specific definition of greed that makes the connections later on in this reading much clearer for me, connecting them to sincerity, to enthusiasm, all these other symptoms of this misestimation.
Yeah, thank you. Fair point. And what I took away from your comment was this sort of reality that we all find ourselves in, the human reality for the desire of, you know, the infinite or eternity. And we were, I think a few weeks ago, we had been discussing this idea of excess and wastefulness, which again will recur, but it was connected in the way that, okay, taking your point that it's a reality that we desire the infinite. You know, we desire happiness and we don't really want it for a limited period of time. We desire sort of sustenance, but not just for a few days, but for as long as we can. But if I view myself in bodily terms and material terms, then I will desire that I will seek that infinite in, let's say, material or limited terms. But if I see myself as an sort of like a a mirror, let's say, or a manifestation of the quality of eternity, then I will also try and seek it in those same terms and look beyond just a material or a limited source of satisfaction, but rather try to go beyond it and seek that which may be eternal. So a couple comments here. Adam says that not sure that even if living in a two-bedroom fulfill one's real needs. Right. If by real you mean, your existential needs. But well, you're welcome to elaborate on the comment. We have another comment by Suhail, and he says, one cannot point to greed out there like the sun because it is a human condition. Therefore, the self defines what it is predicated on, need versus want, and only one knows what one needs. And if you weigh material needs against the eternal need, you'll realize how much you actually materially need. So one cannot point to greed out there like the sun because it is a human condition. To be honest, I don't know what this first sentence actually means. Like, one cannot point to greed out there like the sun because it is a human condition. I'm meaning that, okay. So it means that there's no objective definition of greed, I'm assuming. And it is the individual that defines this idea of greed on need versus want and only knows what one needs. So one, based on their own understanding, and this is my interpretation of your comment, so if I don't do it justice, please feel free to elaborate however you please. So based on how one defines themselves, only he can realize what they actually need. And if you weigh material needs against eternal needs, you realize how much you actually materially need. So if I understand that correctly, if one really realizes that their true need, the need that has to do with their humanity, their identity as a human being, or their status as a human being, and I think this relates one's status or one's identity as a human being, to me relates that somewhat directly to this concept of self-esteem that is mentioned on the next page. So one's definition of themselves or identity as a human being, if they realize that it is entirely dependent on their existential need, that of meaning, that of eternal sort of satisfaction, then obviously there is no comparison between something that is in nature infinite and something that is finite. It's completely entirely opposite, and perhaps there's no sort of there's no comparison in a way that one is more or one is less, because naturally infinite does not has no equivalent or anything similar to it within this universe. Mustafa, please go ahead.
Just to kind of add on to what Adam and Suhail said, or to really just kind of talk through it. So to Adam's point about real needs, I think, yes, that's correct. The idea that there are kind of material needs and our existential needs, there is a difference there. There is a distinction to be made that is very important, that the needs here in this reality for our life, our physical existence, our material existence, differ in the quality, in the quality, in the limitation, in the timeliness. Like they're very different. When I am hungry in this reality for an apple, I will eat an apple, and that physical need will be fulfilled, very simply. While my eternal need, reflecting that or apparent through that interaction, the physical interaction, is I love the creation of apples and the creator of apples and the pleasure that's created through that interaction. And I don't want that to ever go away, because it's a beautiful thing, and the death of it is horrific for me to imagine. So there is an eternal existential need arising from that material need in this world. And there is that's a very important distinction. And Adam, you can chime in whenever you want to, like, kind of shape the point to what you exactly meant. But I want to say that is useful to us. And I think that's what the author is trying to show us. I don't know if I don't want to jump to the existential so quickly. I think looking at our material needs is very useful for understanding our existential ones. Understanding greed in this world in a very real material sense really helps us gauge and understand the infinite one. It's an analogous interaction where our interaction with the creation reminds us of the true interaction with the creator and the infinite interaction with the creator, and how long-lasting and fulfilling that is. And I think that's where contentment lies, in connecting the two, right? You can have an interaction that fulfills your need in the physical realm, but you don't have true contentment unless you connect it to your existential realm, because then you truly feel taken care of. If my favorite example, this is one that Brother Ali always uses, of the child and the parent relationship. A child may be hungry at any moment in time and may have that need fulfilled, whether it's by a parent with love and affection and all of that comes with it, or by a robot that feeds it. Just kind of my addition to this example. Both fulfill the physical need, but one comes from something else. It comes from another being as one kind of difference, and it points to a relationship that is long-lasting, that is larger scale than just the physical need. And if you take that analogy to its greatest extent, the analogy of us being sustained by our sustainer, then contentment is only acquired when we realize that the physical need is being met continuously by this sustainer. And therefore, we have trust and we have true comfort in this reality that we are being taken care of here and in the hereafter. And that hereafter is the true promise of these physical things. It's saying, here, this is the creation of it. This is what it looks like. And here I am. Here is my message, and I'm saying that this will be there for you forever if you accept it. If you accept it without any kind of additions, true to your nature, true to your reality, here it is forever. And that is where contentment is. And I think, going back to the comment, it's those physical needs, it's those kind of material needs that should teach us that lesson, teach me that lesson, that wanting more or thinking that you need more than what you are given at any one time is to Suhail's point, as kind of a subjective thing. You know it when you feel it. You know when you're being greedy, as in that child who's eaten an apple and they feel full and satisfied, and they're like, I miss that feeling. I want to feel the hunger for the apple again, and I want to eat it again. Right? We often have that in ourselves. It's a subjective feeling. I think that's what Suhail's, again, Suhail, correct me if I'm wrong on this. That's what Suhail's point is about, is I I have a need and a desire there with it that is subjective, and only I can measure it within me, right? It's created within me, and therefore only I can see what the degree of its existence. And that when I turn that, again, taking the example of a small child, when the child says, I want to eat more apples to try to relive that experience, the child eats and feels a much reduced pleasure at it. And that lesson there is that it's telling us, don't overstep your need, because this is the creation. The creation here in this material world is limited. Don't try to worship it. Worship the creator of it. Use the physical feeling of pleasure. Use that need to connect yourself to the creator of it, and basically sustain that contentment on that. Make it live forever on that. And I think those are the two kind of mirror or opposite ends of greed and contentment, the different sides of that spectrum, to me, in my understanding.
Khadija, your turn.
I wanted to, as I was listening to Mustafa's comment, what came to mind was what I believe Brother Ali shared a couple of weeks ago about going back to this idea of qualitative and quantitative. So he had shared, in like the satanic perspective of, an Adam reaching for the apple, right? Trying to fulfill the need for eternal life in terms of quantity or something material in that analogy. Being a sort of greedy perspective or greedy attitude for me. And this distinction that we had made about, it's not so much so that, as Mustafa emphasized, it's okay. I mean, it's not that it's okay. Like, it's part of what makes me human to have this need for eternity. But in addition to having the need for eternity, my attitude, insofar as recognizing that the reality of that need and how to meet or fulfill that need, essentially defines whether or not I would be quote unquote greedy or economic or frugal. I think the opposite word the author was using previously was frugal. So in one sense, the moment I try to quantify something, I've already, I think, on Mustafa's point about the material, like, having to have that material relationship and interactions and experiences, I already make the mistake of reaching for the apple, trying to fulfill my needs in terms of material things. And even, on one of the beginning point that Farah had made today about last week's discussion about even, for example, with my need of knowledge, it's not necessarily a bad thing to seek more and more knowledge, but as Faria was saying, I need to question the purpose of existence of that need and align it accordingly. So it's not that necessarily more knowledge makes it greedy for me, but rather, I guess, the attitude or perspective that I approach, or the purpose that I approach it with. So the point that I wanted to essentially kind of touch upon is, like, I already find myself in material relationships with the world as a human being, and I already find myself in a state of making the mistake of trying to meet my needs materially, And I guess that step is essential. I already find myself in that greedy perspective or in that greedy attitude, is already essential, and is already my reality in a way. So that now I can say, hey, no, I need to, the author had been discussing a bunch of things about like how greed causes hardship. It's insufficient. It makes one suffer losses. It makes one beg. It's unsuccessful. A bunch of like all of these things. So then, I think utilizing that, I guess I'm endorsing the point that was made. Utilizing that, and not just like it being necessary, and utilizing those material relationships so that I can internally align myself to still have those material relationships, but not where I'm trying to using those as means rather than the ends to a need.
Thank you for the comments. I think listening to the past two comments, I was sort of forced to sort of reconcile this concept of like, your material existence and your existential existence. And of course, we don't have an existence other than through creation. And so we have to interact with, the life around us that quote unquote materially sustains us. But it is the way that I interact with it, thinking whether the thing in and of itself satisfies me, or that this thing is created by, or must be created by something that has absolute knowledge and power, and ability to satisfy me. And so I think maybe briefly I had an issue with like making this distinction, very black and white, like material and existential, because for us, or like for an individual perhaps who recognizes that things have to have a absolute eternal source, the experience for that individual is sort of more fluid in their interaction with the universe. So it is the way that one views an apple and I think a point came to mind is knowing that there is a conscious connection or a conscious meaning that one can draw on or connect with, makes them makes that thing perhaps gain a different reality. Not only makes ourselves gain a different reality, but what we interact with a different reality. And listening to Mustafa's comment, I was thinking, like, I guess the contentment arises from having established, being certain of a conscious connection with something. That to me is the, I understand as the means or the source of contentment, having a conscious connection with something. So, so far, I think, okay, so we have another comment. Hamim writes, experiencing one orange or 10 oranges is not the point. What kind of acknowledgement do I have that the orange leads to contentment and eternal satisfaction? Thank you for that. And I think it does help sort of complement and sort of add to what I just said, which was, acknowledging that what I'm interacting with has a conscious source, and it is it provides a conscious experience to me or to my consciousness, is what leads to contentment, whether there's one of them or 10 of them. And obviously somebody might be, a person of certain size and needs 4 oranges to satisfy themselves without being greedy, and someone might need just 1. And another person can just look at it and satisfy themselves. So insofar, I think we have sort of really streamlined this definition of greediness or greed as something being a and I would say that I think this during these paragraphs or these pages, greed has been almost sort of like obviously linked with excess and wastefulness, which has been the opposite of frugality. So in one way of understanding all of these definitions is just kind of understanding them in the contraries. But insofar as I can try and summarize greed, it is a lack of awareness or a inconsistency in one's awareness of their reality. It is a with this inconsistency in one's awareness of their reality, they would, in that situation, not consciously, not be able to consciously connect with their reality and their surroundings, and hence not be able to draw from the true source of contentment and be under the impression that their need is not being satisfied, and in trying to satisfy that need, whether materially or let's say materially in like let's say food, money, etc., or in acquiring things like knowledge or praise of others, that again does not they are not acknowledging it in terms of the source of eternal satisfaction. These things sort of seep into one's view of themselves and their world, giving rise to insincerity. And that's sort of, I think, the next connection that we need to solidify in this. And in a way, I think the previous paragraph that we were discussing about, in a way, it seeped into sort of, let's say one's pursuit of knowledge to gain some sort of status or, a reputation in society, I think is related to desiring the regard of others. So again, if you were to relate this concept of greed to insincerity, and taking our discussion from last week, is like, if I pursue something that does not satisfy my need for eternal, for a conscious engagement, and does not lead me to eternal satisfaction, then it opens up a window in which something such as regarding or seeking out something that I don't need, and in this case, justification or regard of others, a status in society that has nothing to do with my need for eternal satisfaction. Those sort of impulses will impurify my direct connection with the conscious, a conscious source of meaning, and something impurifying, or something like that impurifying my intentions for or impurifying my intentions would lead to insincerity. And insincerity is something that I'm defining as or sincerity is like consistency, a perfect sort of match between what I need and the thing that satisfies it, you know, and nothing more or less, or, you know, outside of those spheres. Anything that is not a conscious, eternal source of, you know, a source, anything that does not connect me to a conscious, eternal source is in effect, you know, inconsistent with my needs, and hence insincere to myself. Like I'm being insincere to myself if I seek anything that is not the source of a, you know, a eternal, not an internal source of satisfaction. So that is my sort of comment on the relationship between greed and sincerity. And obviously, when it says damages actions in regard to the hereafter, and we understand hereafter as this sort of fulfillment or this sort of necessity of fulfillment of my desire for eternity. And obviously, this is corrupted if I am attaching myself to anything but that. So that's my comment on greed, its connection with sincerity, and feel free to add to it. In the meantime, I will try and go to the next step of relating a lack of contentment to, or the symptoms of a lack of, you know, enthusiasm for work and laziness, and complaining, and hypocrisy as symptoms of excess and wastefulness. So we discussed this, I think, in the previous point, this rise of illicit actions as a result of excess and wastefulness. And as far as I remember, and people can probably help me remember this, illicit sort of actions came about as a result of someone who viewed their life in terms of things in their material nature being the cause and source of satisfaction. And when one does view things in and of themselves as the source of satisfaction, to them, and I'm just going to like backtrack a little bit and try and remember that. It's found. I mean, if I'm going to try and like remember again, I think it had to do with obviously like I would guess that in this case, when this is another thought perhaps I'm thinking about, which is when one does not, okay, so somebody help me out, licit sustenance is in inverse proportion to ability and will. Right, it definitely had to do related to it. So someone who is, I'm thinking about it in this way, someone who is attaching cause and a satisfaction to things themselves is also not viewing those things existing within an order, an order in which things are made to be the way that they are, and hence that individual can employ those things the way he wants it, according to his personal sort of understanding of the, you know, material world, and then, you know, can lead to him following his own ego, his own desire, without regard to a order in which we observe a uniformity, justice, fairness in system. This is just sort of, an extrapolation at the moment, but so the idea of excess and wastefulness leading someone to lack enthusiasm. As I mentioned before, I think I'm just viewing lack of enthusiasm and laziness as symptoms which arise from sort of viewing that a person can somehow himself be be in control and have the ability to satisfy himself according to his definition. Because I do not have meaning and purpose, hence lack of enthusiasm. That's right, that's a comment from Hamim. I agree with you. I think there are a lot of practical examples for this. We see that a lot in nature, but also in our own lives. When you give, let's say, a task to a child or even to an adult, doesn't matter, in work environments, for example, and they're not clear about the goal or why they're doing it, they will lack motivation to do so. And when you lack motivation to do so, you come up with excuses, which is complaining. You're not organized and you're not sort of active about that effort, causing laziness. So when I think about our desire for eternal satisfaction, if one does connect themselves with knowing that, okay, the source of this particular thing, whatever that might be, is an eternal conscious source, no matter what time of the day it is, no matter what sort of condition individual might be in, that eternal source is unchanging by definition. And when you have, so to say, a North Star, something that is always consistent, always present, not changing, sort of, sort of continuous, with no change in its nature, then your sense of direction, your sense of motivation has an infinite source of, you could say, an infinite source. And any time that you refer to it, your sense of motivation is renewed as if it was in the first place. Like, it never lacks any sort of energy. Whereas we see this in any other part of life. You start out, and it's like a common phenomena, whether you take like, oil in a car or, breakfast in the morning, you consume something, it has an initial burst of energy, and soon, it peaks and it plateaus and starts to decline. And that's the nature with anything that has a limited, that is characterized by a limited form or source of energy or motivation in this case. And so excess and wastefulness is the individual who is defining themselves in material terms, in terms of things being the cause of themselves. And if things are being the cause of themselves, then they have a limited source of motivation and excitement and energy, and it is bound to lead to laziness and a lack of enthusiasm. It cannot sustain one's desires. I know we're at time, but I think we also sort of started a few minutes later. But we have another comment here by Suhail. Excess and wastefulness implies an ignorance, whether willful or not, of being given. When that is the case, your expectation don't meet reality and lead to dissatisfaction rather than gratefulness. That's right. Having excess and wastefulness, as we have been discussing in connection with greediness, is a lack of awareness of the fact that I am a created being, surrounded by a creation that is entirely a result of being brought into existence. And if I do not approach my life with that sense of consciousness, then I will obviously be dissatisfied from the things on themselves, cannot satisfy me, and I'll be dissatisfied. And I will also have no reason to be grateful, because obviously without a conscious interaction with my self and my surroundings, there's no need to be acknowledging anyone or anything, or reciprocate or acknowledging in the form of gratefulness. In this point of destroying self-respect, and it comes again in the next paragraph, the contented person is respected and the greedy person despised, according to the Hadith. Contentment gives rise to self-esteem. So this is probably the last comment I will make, but everyone else is welcome to contribute. So I understand that, self-esteem is a understanding of someone's or an individual's sense of worth. And one's sense of worth needs to come from somewhere. Some people may define their sense of worth as related to, let's say, their job title, their family, their nationality, ethnicity, so forth. And those, as we know from our experiences, can always be dented or, sort of disturbed. You say a comment about somebody's, ethnicity, and that seems to attack or demean their sense of self-worth. But if someone has attached or rooted or grounded their sense of self-worth, not in themselves, in their in their understanding that they themselves are the source of their identity or their self, sense of self, but rather that is given to them, and not only given to them, but given to them by a being that must be absolute in all sense of the word, especially in the sense of all powerful, and in the sense of the most great, let's say, in this sense, like nothing is more esteemed than this source. And if somebody has grounded their sense of identity in this source, then there is nothing that can be said or done that sort of dents or harms this, because it has, if I'm not claiming my identity to be mine, then no matter what anybody says, I should not be negatively or even positively, in that sense, affected. Neither should I feel pride or embarrassed of it. And contentment gives rise to self-esteem. Is contentment, this concept that we've been discussing, this attachment to a eternal consciousness, and eternal source. I always keep fumbling this part. An eternal source of existence, conscious source of existence, then it should, if I've attached myself to this source and not attached myself to anything else, then I'm in one way free from all sorts of dependency in this world, and I should have a sense of self-worth that should be a reflection of the qualities of this eternal source of being. So that's my thought on self-esteem and sense of self-worth. And if there are no comments tonight, additional comments on the topics that have been discussed after, specifically on sincerity, this sort of lack of enthusiasm, and then leading into self-esteem, then we can propose to conclude our discussion here. Hatija Beza, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I know we're out of time. I just wanted to kind of share one thing on my mind with one thing that you've said a little earlier about this sense of greed and contentment and laziness and enthusiasm. So I was thinking, with the earlier discussions that we've had as well leading up to this point, it's not that greed is lazy in the sense that a greedy person does not do anything. In our very earlier discussions, we had discussed like how two people could be doing the exact same thing, as in following the order of the universe, but that one could be greedy and the other one could be one who is economic or frugal. So then I was thinking, the difference between striving with greed versus striving with contentment. I guess the striving with greed becomes lazy in the sense that, I guess, and I know we're out of time, but what I was thinking was that, I guess it's one where one doesn't use their, or maybe they do, but I was thinking initially maybe a situation where one doesn't use their free will in trying to make sense of their reality, because the greedy attitude deems that, one must, or the one who is greedy is the one who is attaining whatever it is that they want for themselves. So definitely it's not lazy in the sense that they're not doing anything. I guess like at all times I'm using my free will one way or another, whether or not I consciously choose to do something. But then the sincere one, or the content one, then is one who follows the order of the universe with the consciousness of the order, and with the awareness of the bestower of their needs, and with the awareness of the nature of their existential needs. So perhaps the laziness or the lack of enthusiasm for the one who is greedy is lazy in the sense that not that they're not doing anything, but from this lack of enthusiasm from a sense of despair is what I was getting at in my mind. So, if I have, let us assume that I am aware that I have a need for eternity, but I cannot attain it within the things themselves. And if I'm just stuck there, then that leads me to a sense of despair, which would lead to a lack of enthusiasm in the things that I would do. On one hand, or on the other hand, I could just keep striving more and more and more, but to what ends, I guess, would be my question. But I do apologize for going over time. Thank you.
No worries at all. Thank you. I think it was an important point, and something that we did discuss in previous discussions, that laziness, and thank you for the reminder, laziness here doesn't just mean like, some sort of physical sort of laziness lying around here and there, but rather perhaps a laziness in not using our human consciousness and ability in attributing, or interacting with our creation, with creation, in the way that we are supposed to, using our human senses. And of course, we see this very often. We obviously there's a big community in the world that may not associate themselves as believing, yet they are very productive, physically speaking, economically speaking. So there needs to be a sort of redefining, what we mean by laziness and sort of lack of enthusiasm. And I think this is probably the point that I would pick up from next week is redefining these attributes, I guess, of laziness, lack of enthusiasm, and what for our purposes. And inshallah, that will help us then transition into the paragraph. Also, the contentment arising from frugality opens the door of thanks. And that's where we would, inshallah, start reading from next week. So I will leave it there, host.
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair, everyone. Beautiful discussion. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Glory be unto you. We have no knowledge save except that which you've taught us. Indeed, you are all knowledgeable, all wise. وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين بحرمة سورة الفاتحة.